Hello, and welcome to the Sailing and Cruising the East Coast of the United States podcast. I'm Bela Musits.
And I'm Mike Wasserman.
Today's guest on the podcast is Mike Malekoff. Mike is a frequent guest on the podcast, and in his previous episode, we talked about getting his boat ready for an extended cruise from Georgia, where he lives, down to the Florida Keys. Well, the planning went great, and in this episode, we're going to talk about what actually happened on his trip and what you do when things don't go exactly as planned.
Ooh, Bela, I hope this isn't bad news for Mike. He is such an interesting guest, and it's been really cool to follow his adventures. And I think listeners will want to look out for answers to three important questions. One, how big of a deal is cold weather in warm climates? Second question, what impact do supermoons have on trip planning? And third, how many toilets are too many on a sailboat?
I know the answer to your last question, Mike. Yeah. There's no such thing as too many toilets on a sailboat. Agreed. But there clearly is too few. Yeah. All right. Let's get to this great conversation Mike Malekoff and I had. So if I remember correctly, Mike, the last time you were on the podcast, we talked about you planning a trip from Georgia, where your boat is now, down to Key West. And we sort of talked about the various different elements and planning and how you do that and how you prepare for a trip, how you prepare the boat, how you prepare yourself, etc. And so time has passed now, and you guys started that trip.
Yes.
And so I thought we'd sort of talk about that a little bit. So take it away from that.
Yeah. So are you going to start the podcast in a certain place, or was that it? Or did I just
we're rolling. We're rolling.
Oh, you don't want to do any introduction or anything like that, or
Mike and I will do that like we normally do.
Okay. All right.
And you're become a regular on the podcast now, so I'm starting to feel like I have to pay you a retainer or something.
I was just going to say my residuals have not come yet.
Yeah, well, either of mine.
Neither of yours.
Yeah.
People think you get rich doing this stuff. And I think unless you start doing podcasts of you bunging off of buildings or something, I don't know that there's much of a dollar value in it.
Yeah, there's no dollar value in this. And although if you can get up to, I've thought about this because I'm doing it. If you can get up to about 100,000 downloads per episode,
right,
then you can start making some serious money. YouTube, that is. Podcasts are about the same. The payout rate is close to being the same, but you got to get up to like 100,000, and I'm at about 1,000 downloads per episode.
I was going to say, how many are you short?
So I'm short quite a bit.
That's okay. Screw them. Yours is much more educational than entertaining.
And I clearly don't do it for the money.
And your music career is not going to do it either.
Yeah, I'm not getting any residuals from that either.
All right.
So take us through our trip. Take us through your trip.
Hey, Bela, how are you today?
I'm good.
Yeah, this was quite interesting when you talked about continuing our discussions, and yes, after my wife and I, our expedition from Vermont to the Bahamas, which in my estimation was a huge success, and then we ended up settling in Georgia where the boat is, and it taking a break and it being on the hard and then putting it back in the water. Our next big trip that we had planned for, we had put off for quite a while, was to go from Georgia to the Keys. And I think the last time I was on the podcast, I spoke a little bit about why we took the break, and I had health issues with prostate cancer that had to be dealt with. And then part of our decision, because of elderly parents and illnesses, that we decided to stay close in the United States instead of going into the Bahamas, where it's more difficult to go back and forth in case there was an emergency. So we had set this up. I had gone through all of my treatments. And as I mentioned on the last thing, for men, get your PSA tests because it's really important. And I'm here because it was caught early because of that. So as a survivor, my present from my wife was that we take the boat down to the Keys. And we had set that up last year in the fall with the idea of leaving early January. So we had a couple of early appointments. I was getting the boat ready. I think during my treatments, because I was very limited in what I could do health-wise, I spent a lot of time fiddling around on the boat and getting it ready for that. So it really was a good distraction for me. And we were planning to leave January 10th to head down to the Keys, and we had actually made reservations down in the Keys because it's very popular that we were going to go to a specific marina in the Keys for the month of February, and then after February, return back to Georgia. So those were our plans. And as I think the quote goes, that the best laid plans of mice and men can often go awry. And I think that's probably where we can start, that the plans were great, the execution was not.
So you can't leave us hanging there, man.
Yes, I guess I will say the biggest problem with cruising on a sailboat has to be schedules. Yeah. And, we've talked about it. I've mentioned it a lot. If you have a schedule, you're in trouble. And we did have a schedule, but I felt that I was able to plan enough time that this schedule of leaving in early January, getting to the Keys, being in the Keys for a month, and then returning afterwards was a sound one. I basically gave us, our boat is located in Brunswick at Brunswick Landing Marina, which I've talked about in the past, a great hurricane hole. It's a live-aboard marina. There's probably a couple hundred plus boats there. It's a great place to keep your boat. And from there, I kind of figured it out for this podcast. It's about 420 nautical miles by the ICW from Brunswick to Miami. So essentially, if you figure it out, we had always used 40 miles a day as a reasonable amount of miles on our sailboat, which is a Hunter 44 deck salon boat, almost identical to yours, except for 1 foot, I believe, that you have me beat by. And our cruising, we look at going 40 miles, which is reasonable per day. Well, 420 nautical miles at 10 days should bring us down to Miami. And then from Miami, you are now about 60, from where we were going, was another 60 nautical miles to Marathon, the island, which is about halfway down, which is where we were planning to stay. So we were leaving January 10th with the idea of the 400 plus nautical miles is give or take a good 10-day trip, which would get us to the 20th or 21st and still gave me 10 more days for a buffer. So we prepared to leave. We might have even planned to leave a day or two early, but as you know, in the north, we live in the south now. So we don't get cold weather and snow. Well, right around the end of the year, in the beginning of January, your terrible weather managed to make its way down to us in Georgia and Florida, where it snowed. And the day we were leaving from Brunswick, it was 30 degrees.
Oh, wow.
So right away, right off the bat, is we had to plan and pull out all our winter clothes for the boat to leave. And as anybody that's sailed on a boat or been on a boat, when it's below freezing, is not enjoyable. It's just cold. So right away, we delayed a day or so, and we finally left. It got up to 32 degrees, and we were off and running. And our first stop was Fernandina, which is right over the Florida line. And we went offshore, which is what we like to do, and left. And it was a pleasant ride, I'll call it, because we couldn't sail, but it was cold. And then we got into Fernandina, and now that 10-day buffer I had, we kind of used one or so for the cold weather. We're now in Fernandina, and we get into the anchorage right before the north winds start blowing to lower the wind chill to about 10 degrees. So now we're sitting, and overnight it was blowing 30 to 40. At 10, the temperature was 30 degrees. The wind chill, I don't know what it was. And I sat in the cockpit almost all night, making sure we didn't drag. And it just blew and it blew and it blew. Well, by the morning, it let up a little bit. It was still windy, but I hadn't slept much. So I said, well, let's just hang here, and it's going to pass over today. And then tomorrow we'll get started, but I wanted to get a good night's sleep. So now I'm down to 7 days buffer because I'm, watching the clock, so to speak. And we left from there, but because of the wind, we couldn't go outside now because the weather and the seas were 6 to 8 feet. So now we're going to do the ICW to get to St. Augustine. So normally Fernandina to St. Augustine is a day on the water outside, but now it's 2 days to go down the ICW. It's just the reality of the situation and how long it takes. And we finally get to St. Augustine. It warmed up to 34 degrees in St. Augustine. So it's really cold, and we're there. And normally we stay an extra day because we like St. Augustine. So as you can see, I'm whittling away my buffer days a little bit, but I'm still good. So we're getting to leave there. And because of the weather outside, we're going to stay on the ICW to go to the next stop. But one of the things that was brought up to us that we were running into was a supermoon. And I don't know how much you're familiar with supermoons and what it does to the tides, but the ICW, especially down south, can get pretty shallow. Well, let's see. Let's take that shallow and lower it down 1 to 2 feet more. So now we're worrying about grounding on our way down. So now we're going to stop an extra night because we can't go fast enough because we're avoiding these really shallow areas or waiting for the tides to come up. And it's still cold. We eventually get to a marina in New Smyrna, where my wife's, we have 2 bathrooms on our boat, as you probably do. Yep. And that was a requirement of my wife because her famous quote is, if we only have 1 bathroom and it goes, I'm not using a bucket.
Right.
Which I'll give that quote to my wife. So we have 2 bathrooms. Hers went on the fritz right about then and started leaking. So hers basically was becoming unusable, and that meant I had to now figure out and start taking things apart to figure out why the toilet was now leaking all over the place. So we're now in that mode, and I turned the water off there. So we just let it go because we do have the second bathroom that is usable, and I'll start figuring out when I have time when we get in. But now we're running into a little bit more trouble. So we're doing okay, and now we're going to our next stop, but we're staying on the inside to Titusville, which is next to Cape Canaveral. And we did get to see a rocket launch because you're right there, which was nice. So that kind of helped us a little bit. But soon after that, when we started going, we heard this crazy noise in my bathroom that sounded like water was shooting all over the place. And sure enough, as we played, it turns out one of the water connections in my bathroom snapped off. We don't know whether it was because we got waked by a boat and our boat shook and healed real quick, or whatever the reason. So we were now heading toward 0 bathrooms. So I guess I'm getting long-winded here, but right now the trip was definitely becoming questionable, because now I need parts. And as you know, when you're traveling and stuff, well, that's great. If you're at home and you order a part and it comes overnight or maybe 2 nights with the mail system, well, that's fine. Or if it's delayed. Well, when you're on a boat and you're trying to move, it doesn't work like that. And then we're trying to find parts for a boat that ours is a 2005, which means it's a 20-year-old boat. And for some reason, I was not able to go down to the local Hunter parts store and find the exact parts that I needed.
Yeah.
So now we're trying to figure out, and the connection that broke in my bathroom was a shower that handles all the water that comes into my bathroom. And let me tell you, trying to find those parts, 5 marinas later and hardware stores, that my wife actually came up with a solution on sort of a Rube Goldberg type of thing to redo the connections without having to buy a new shower mixer for the boat. But anyway, now we're talking 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, and we're sitting waiting for parts. So I've now whittled away, my buffer is gone at this point, and we're still 4 or 5 days north of Miami. In getting there. So I guess I can keep going through what was a downhill slide at this point. And then we also ran into more bad weather. For whatever reason, that cold spell that came down, it was a northerly wind, and that also affected all the offshore currents. And, you know, we're safe, cautious sailors. We are not 6 to 8 to 12-foot waves out in the ocean that we're willing to, if they're against. We're going to sit and wait until the seas calm down, which they didn't. They just didn't. And we were running into a lot of other boats that were all stuck. As a matter of fact, we actually ran into some people that had been sitting for over a month to cross into the Bahamas. So it just became incredibly difficult. And then we finally came to the realization when we got down near Palm Beach that, and I'm looking now at the weather for crossing to the Keys, because once you leave Miami, no more ICW, no more harbors to duck into. You're literally out on the open ocean, period. And that was from Miami all the way down into the Keys. And now we're still looking at 6 to 8 to 10-foot seas part of the way. So I'm looking at our reservation is February 1st, and I'm figuring we're going to get there the 21st now. And that marina, any marina in the Keys is very expensive. You know, it's not, you know, $500. You're talking thousands. And then it's like by the time we get there, we're going to have to prepare to leave to get back because we can't stay longer because they're booked. So we said, fine, can we cancel? Because we had enough time. They said, yes, you can cancel at this point. We canceled. We stayed in Palm Beach for an extra couple days to see friends that were there and said, we're just going to go back. So needless to say, I don't have any pink sand beaches or golden water, aqua blue water that we dived in. We were in a boat that was freezing cold with leaking water and high winds and heavy seas. And so we decided to head back, and you figure, okay, you did us in, let us get back. And we go to leave, and the next morning they had predicted some fog. So I'm going to be cautious about that. We'll see. We're leaving the marina to go out on the ocean to start heading back because the seas were going to be calm. And we got hit with sea fog. And sea fog is thicker than regular fog, which I now know. And we were faced with 3 hours of not being able to see at all. Everything had to be run off of the chart plotter and the compass. And it really was, it was not enjoyable. I definitely ever saw a fog alert again. I would not tempt it. You know, it seemed fine when we were leaving. There was no fog at all, but it rolled in after we left. So that really cracked my wife, as I would say, and she just wanted to get home at that point. And, you know, we went outside a couple of times and then had the seas go from 2 feet to 5 feet to 6 feet just to really rub it in. And we did. We finally made our way back, and here I am back in Georgia.
Well, you made it, number one.
We did make it.
Right. No trips to the emergency room. No sea tow had to be called.
No.
So all in all, it was a good trip.
You know, it was, and I've used this term many times when people talk about, you know, the lifestyle, that it's not a vacation, it's an adventure.
Right.
And we definitely had our share of the adventure this time.
And you know, sometimes there's a fine line between adventure and an ordeal.
We crossed that line.
Yeah. And you know, then it becomes not fun. And that's the challenge. But it's a good lesson here, I think. All right. And it's a good lesson for our listeners to sort of realize that you have to be flexible, and when you're not flexible and you push on, that's when sometimes real bad things can happen. And
yes,
because your thinking is, you're tired, you're exhausted, you're not thinking clearly, you're making poor decisions, and you know, something not pleasant, seriously not pleasant, can happen. So I'm like you, I'm super conservative. I like to think about, you know, it's okay if I don't get there. I'm much happier not having crises, and because not making it to my destination is not a crisis. I make it so that if I don't make it, it's not a crisis.
Yeah, and you know, in a way, you know, we kind of had to chalk that one up to that fact that, okay, it isn't a crisis in the sense that, you know, as you said, we didn't get towed, you know, or deal with anything that was could have been something where we were injured or life-threatening.
Right.
It was just very, very frustrating because I thought we had planned this enough that I know schedules aren't very good, but I figured 3 weeks to get from Georgia to the Keys was easily doable. And boy, I'll tell you, we just ate away at our buffer. And you know, and very simply, by leaving the beginning of January, now you're all the way up north, so there's no sailing up there, but the winter weather and seas just can go on and on and on. And I'll tell you what, there were a lot of people that were stuck and unhappy and, you know, just, you know, waiting for a window to cross. Right. So I felt a little better when some people were sitting in a mooring for 6 weeks, waiting to try and cross over to the Bahamas and
right.
You know, stuck there. And that also made it challenging to find a place to stay because you had a backlog of all these boats that were stuck in these places. As a matter of fact, and here's another one of the fun things. For years, whenever we went down south, going back and forth, we always went to a place called Jensen Beach Mooring Field. And it was just a good location. The guy that ran it was really good. It was a city facility. And we made a reservation there to go to the facility there. And we booked it for a week because that in my original plan was going to be where we'd sit our buffer before we headed outside to go down to the Keys, down and stop one day by Miami. So whether we used all 5 or 6 or 7 days that I had booked or used 4, it was my buffer. If I had to fix something, that's where I was going to do it. And we came in there, winds are blowing again. And if there's one thing that my wife is not happy about is when the winds are blowing 20 plus, getting a mooring ball is not easy. It can be a challenge, and a challenge in the sense that she can catch the ball sometimes, but the boat starts blowing off and you're lifting that ball and the thing, you have to be strong sometimes, and it rips it away from her. And I go around again, to come in. Well, we're going into Jensen to get our mooring ball. I made the reservation. I had it for a week. I know what ball number it is, and it's blowing. So we're kind of looking, and she's got binoculars. I'm saying, where is it? She's looking. Now we're getting close to the mooring field, and she doesn't see it. So I said, well, let me go through. It's there somewhere, and they're all numbered. Well, lo and behold, our first trip through the mooring field, there's no number 34, which was ours. It's not there. Now we're looking. Well, the place is full, and there's several that aren't even there, but there was one. And I said, well, there's one there. It's getting late in the day. This wind is picking up. Let's go there, and I'll call. So we go there. It took us 2 or 3 times for her to get it before we finally got onto the ball. Now the winds are easily 30 plus.
Wow.
But we're on the ball. We're on the ball. So I call. I left a message, didn't hear from anybody. And I said, well, it's getting late. Who else is going to come? Well, we're here. Finally, the person that runs the mooring field calls and said, I explained to him what happened. Our ball isn't there. You just don't have it. So this one was open. We grabbed it. They said, well, you can't have it. You have to leave. I said, no, I have a ball for a week. I said, what am I supposed? There's nobody here. Well, somebody has that reserved. And I said, well, that's good luck because there's nowhere to go right now. And we're talking about the winds are whipping, the seas are whipping. I've got nowhere to go. Well, it turned out the boat that belonged there was actually on the dock of the mooring field, broken down.
Oh, okay.
They didn't know that. So they kept insisting that I had to get off. And I'm saying, I'm not getting off. Well, they said, well, if you don't get off, we're going to call the police.
Oh my gosh, you're kidding.
No. I said, be my guest, because I don't think they can drive out here. I said, you need to figure this out. Anyway, it was just one more thing. And finally it got sorted out, that this broken down boat didn't want to leave the dock to come out where we were. And I sorted it out with them personally. And they finally said to the person that was managing the field, I said, no, we figured it out. And, so needless to say, that was another problem that we had to deal with. It was difficult. So
that's clearly an ordeal.
Yes. And my poor wife at this point, after everything else, was again putting this one on top of all the other problems. So I've probably gone way too long. But coming back to schedules, it's just the fact that even though we had planned and it was going to be a 2.5 to 3 month trip, it wasn't enough time for cruising. And I kind of look back now and I've said, there can't be schedules. And unfortunately, part of the scheduling problem is when you're going to a popular place like the Keys, if you're going to a marina, you have to book it. And in some cases, people said in the Keys, you got to book it almost a year in advance. So yeah. I booked this, back in 6 months ahead of time. So in a way, I locked myself into a schedule, but there was no other way. I guess I could have said I could have left earlier and given us an extra 3 weeks or something. But I'm like, geez, wait, it's not going to take me 6 weeks to get to the Keys.
Right. Yeah, you could walk to the Keys in 6 weeks.
Or as my wife said, you could have ridden your bike there.
So I think, I wonder if, and maybe this is just trying to slice it too thin, but there's schedules or a plan for a schedule, and then there's a destination, right? And it's those two things that are sort of driving you. And I guess my point is, if you don't have a destination, then you don't need a schedule. And oftentimes when I go out sailing for the day, I don't know where I'm going. It depends what direction the wind's blowing, right? And that's okay. And that's okay for a day sail, of course.
Right.
But when you're trying to get to someplace, it's that destination that's sort of driving you to keep a schedule, to make a schedule, to have a plan. And maybe it's really, as some people have said, just focus on the journey itself. And if you make it to the destination, great. And if you don't, so be it. But I understand the constraints, right? If you're going to the destination, you got to make a reservation for a place to stay. It becomes, there's a whole bunch of other factors in play here. It's not as simple as I made it sound. There's a whole bunch of other factors.
And I think there's also the difference of what, and I've said this before, we're your fair weather type cruisers where, we're not always, say, interested in just going and we'll find a place, type of thing, or we'll throw the anchor down because, if the weather turns on you or something happens, I guess that comes back to me being the scheduler, is I want to have a backup plan,
right?
Or a marina scheduled that we can get into in case the weather turns on us. Plus, the other side is, we do enjoy getting off the boat, and in many cases, we've found this since we've been cruising a long time. You get to a place you've never been, you would never drive there, and all of a sudden you're in the nicest restaurant you'd ever imagine that somebody told you, the dockmaster said, oh, try this place, you'll love it.
Right.
And, so we enjoy that aspect. I think going to the Keys, it was just this factor that there's really very few places to hide because it is, all of these islands linked together, that there aren't a lot of marinas to choose from.
Yes.
And especially, I guess the other part is, if people ever thought of going to the Keys, you can go down on the west side or you can go on the east side. The west side is more protected and there are more marinas, but it's not good for sailboats because it's so shallow on the west side that you can have, problems with your boat, especially if you're 6 feet or more. So sailboats, for the most part, are limited to the east side where it's more open water and you're not going to have depth issues. And that's basically how we were going down.
Yeah. So, yeah. Well, it sounds like, a great trip, one could say, a good learning experience. And I think there's a lot of good takeaways from here of, it's important to make a plan, but at the same time, having some flexibility around it is really key. And oftentimes when you're going to crowded places where you have to have a reservation, that drives your schedule. Right. And then the question is, the roll of the dice is, how many days do you build in for a buffer? Right. Whatever number of days you build in for a buffer, it's probably not going to be the right number. It's either going to be too many or not enough.
Well, that was my fear from the beginning, that I was going to get down there too early.
Right.
And not be able to get into the marina where we had a reservation. So it was, one of these catch-22 situations. But
exactly.
I think, you touched on this, and I think it's important that if people are sailing that are listening to this or have been cruising, they're going, I know all about that. That's happened to us. We've gotten caught and stuck and it's turned into a horrible trip. Or if people are thinking of doing this, is that, sometimes it's just not going to work out if you're cruising on a sailboat. And you just have to say it can happen. And if it does, like you said, you just chalk it up. Right. And it wasn't a great trip. And, there were times that we did enjoy it. And I reminded my wife, because she was the one that really became challenged after a while with all of the hurdles. And it's like, geez, every day it was like something else. It was the mooring ball thing. It was the water breaking in the boat, not finding the parts and the high winds. And yet there were those times where, we saw a rocket launch up close, where we were in Titusville is 3 miles. You could see the rocket sitting there. And we were able to watch the rocket launch. And I did try and make this an interesting one. When we were coming into one of the inlets against the current, high winds, that we were surfing coming in. And as you can imagine, surfing on a surfboard is one thing. Having your sailboat surf in for, say, about a mile, can be exhausting and controlling the boat. My wife turned around and there were dolphins surfing next to us. And all of a sudden the mood changed from, oh my gosh, you should be more to the right, more to the left, watch the next wave. And then all of a sudden it all went away because the dolphins were surfing next to us and they were jumping and doing flips. Basically, they were playing. And that changed, for the moment, it changed our attitude that, oh, this isn't as bad as we thought. So there were those things. And we did find a couple new restaurants that we enjoyed. And we do enjoy St. Augustine, both going down and coming back, as a historical site. And, there are, good restaurants and stuff there. So there were positive elements. We just didn't make it to the Keys.
Hey, so Mike, thanks so much for sharing this with our listeners. A good follow-up to the previous episode we did about planning a trip, and to do a little bit of foreshadowing here of things to come. You and I are going to plan a trip this spring together, and that'll hopefully result in a podcast episode or two. I will leave it at that and leave our listeners in suspense.
I think it will be at least a podcast or two.
That's right.
And hopefully our future, and I say our future plans, go a lot smoother than my trip to the Keys. But this one will not have an end date that has to be met. So let's put it like that. So anyway, that was a good teaser.
Thanks again, Mike, for being on the podcast. Talk to you soon.
Bela, it was so good being on the podcast. And as I say to all your people listening, don't be afraid to give it a try. And as I said, it's not necessarily a vacation, but an adventure.
Wow, that's quite a story, Bela. It really is a real world look at sailing to popular places under the naturally uncertain conditions, shall we say, of sailing. It was a story of really good planning and building buffer time in, just, I think, by the book, right? But going head to head against weather, bad luck, but then ultimately making good decisions under stress. Bela, what were your big takeaways?
Yeah, lots of times in life, things don't go as planned. And I think that sailing in particular has a high propensity for that. So you have to sort of be flexible. And somebody once said, the difference between sort of a fun adventure and an ordeal is attitude. And I try to recall that when things are not going as planned and it's starting to feel like an ordeal, and just say, hey, look, this is just, it's okay, right? We're not in danger. We're not going to die. This is just what hand you're dealt, and let's make it into a pleasant thing, because then it's much more enjoyable than if it's not. So having said that, here's one of the things that sailing has really taught me. You know, in sort of our day-to-day life, meaning not out on the boat, but sort of at home, at work, going food shopping, etc. We are relatively immune to things like wind and temperature and weather and the tides and tidal current. I very rarely think about those things when I'm at home. I mean, maybe I think about the weather, if we're going to have a blizzard or a snowstorm or thunderstorms or something. But other than that, it really doesn't impact my life. And so, but when you're out on the boat, a cruising boat or a sailboat or a motorboat, it doesn't matter, man, those things really impact what's going on. And all of those things you can't control. Can't control the wind, can't control the temperature. Tides are predictable and the current is predictable, but you can't control them. You sort of know when they're going to happen, but you can't control them. So here again, it gets back to attitude, right? There's no reason to be pissed off against the weather because it's not going to do you any freaking good. So the notion of trip planning, I think, is key here. And Mike had this in there, right? Be flexible. Don't make it a tight schedule. I remember for a period of time, I worked for a small commuter airline when I was in school, and they used to fly between Dutchess County Airport, which is in Poughkeepsie, New York, down to New York City, down to LaGuardia. And the flight took 45 minutes if the weather was good. And if the weather was bad, meaning all the planes were instrument flight rules and they have to increase the distance between airplanes and all that kind of stuff, the flight took an hour and a half. But the schedule only allowed for an hour and a half from the time the plane lands to the time the plane takes off for the return trip. So if there was bad weather, all the flights that day were going to be late, every one of them. So my point being is that you have to build in big buffer times when you're on the water. And Mike did that, but still things sort of didn't happen as planned. So you got to be flexible. Go with the breeze, as they say, and have a good attitude about it. And I think it's about the journey, not the destination. And if you have a good attitude, the journey will be exciting and fun and adventurous. If you make it purely about the destination and you don't get there, then it sort of feels more like an ordeal. That's my 2 cents. What did you think about that, Mike?
Well, those are great points. I mean, I totally agree with the flexibility thing. And I think being flexible and kind of responsive to things around you are a secret to success in life, not just sailing. But it was very clear that, you know, you have to do both in order to make it work. So I think that point was cool. I have two kind of minor questions. Well, I did learn about supermoons. I had to look that one up because I had never heard of a supermoon, and I had no idea, and that was built in the distance and all these things. That was kind of cool. But I couldn't find a good answer. So first question, is sea fog really thicker than fog on land? And if so, why? Or is it just an optical illusion? And then the second one is this thing about parts. And I started to think about how you get parts on a trip. And you know, kind of what's the way that you get parts if you're in the middle of a trip and something breaks? So those are my two kind of questions.
I don't know about the fog. That's a great question, Mike. I will tell you that I've experienced pretty dense fog, both on land and out on water. You know, I've driven the car when it feels like you can't see more than 50 feet in front of you because it's so foggy. And I've sometimes I've gotten into fog on water where it appears that way. I think that the thing that makes it more of a challenge on water than on land is if you're experiencing fog on land and there's lots of objects around you, whether they be trees or cars or houses, you sort of get a feeling for sort of how dense the fog is, because you sort of have that depth piece going for you. When you're in a field, in the middle of a field, or you're in the middle of a big lake or a big body of water, you don't have that depth. So it's really hard to figure out, is my visibility 50 feet, 100 feet, or 100 yards? That's the part that I have a challenge with. But I do think your question is interesting, and maybe there's some meteorological folks out there who can help answer that question for us. Now, the second part, how do you get things shipped to you when you're on the move? Well, most marinas allow you to ship things there, and some marinas, if you, let's say you sort of need to stay there, right? You got to pay for a night's slip. But if you tell them, hey, look, I got a reservation with you guys on next Wednesday, and I'm going to ship some parts there. They'll have my name on them. Please hold them for me, because I expect them to arrive on Monday or Tuesday, and I'll be at your place on Wednesday. Most marinas are very happy to do that because they understand that's sort of what life is like. I also say that some marinas, like our marina where we are, they have a small inventory of sort of common repair parts and maintenance parts. There's some things on a boat, like there's that the marina might be replacing when they're doing maintenance on an engine. So there's water pump parts. There's things like nuts and bolts and toilet seals, some of those things, and hose clamps and that kind of stuff. But any specialty parts, they're not going to stock. I will say that in some towns, so probably a 15-minute Uber ride from our marina, there's a West Marine, which is a sort of a marine parts store. Many places that have a high concentration of boats might have a marine store close by. But given how shipping works these days, and you can get something delivered from almost anywhere to almost anywhere in 2 days, most marinas are very gracious about getting parts shipped there. But it's still a challenge. I mean, sometimes the challenge, you just can't find the part because it's a custom part, or it is across the country and it's going to take a week to get there, and your boat's not functioning for that week because it's really a critical part. So people who go out on cruises often talk about having spare parts lists of, I imagine that's probably what it was like in the 20s and 30s when you had a car. The trunk was for all your spare parts because if you're going on a long trip, you're going to break down. So people talk about, and you can find on the internet, you can find these sort of lists of what spare parts should you be taking with you, because these are the common things that fail, or if these things fail, you're sort of out of luck. And that can get pretty pricey on some things. There's some things that are just cost prohibitive to bring an extra one. So anyway, that's sort of a long answer to your very simple question.
Interesting. I think a cool business idea for somebody who's looking for an entrepreneurial, I know that's our other podcast, but an entrepreneurial venture. It seems to me like somebody with a good 3D printer that prints metal. These are expensive, but they're more and more common, prices coming down, or has access to one. And let's say you're in an area like where you're at, or Boston or Maine, or somewhere with a lot of sailors, right? Or Tampa or wherever, right? You've got a metal 3D printer. You can print parts on demand, right? And you have a drone that delivers them. You could be out on the water as long as you're within a half a mile or whatever, right? And they could literally come to your boat, right, and drop them. This would be cool.
You could do that without the 3D printer,
right? Sure.
You could just have a drone. Right. Oh, I like the drone idea. Deliver them to your boat, right?
Yeah, why not? Cool. I think that technology is fine. And if you're delivering it to a boat, some of the things that I've read about the problems with drone delivery to people's houses or to businesses is you got people, you know what I mean?
Right.
So you can't drop it where somebody will steal it, or where it's going to hit somebody in the head, or where it's going to freak somebody out. But if you're out on the water, now maybe if you're in the marina, it's a little problematic, right?
Right.
But if you're out on the water, or you're out on a mooring ball somewhere, right, that isn't hugely dense, it seems to be pretty easy, even with medium winds, right, to get that drone and just drop the package right in your hand or right on deck.
Well, even if you wrap it in waterproof packaging, you drop it in the water and you go out there with your dinghy and pick it up.
It's all in plastic anyways. Right. You're with your hook, with the hook you use to get the mooring ball.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah.
So
If you're at the marina, the normal delivery guy can bring it.
Right. But if you're out somewhere, especially if you're stuck in the water, right?
Yeah. That's a clever idea. There you go. There you go, Mike.
I like it for somebody out there, some enterprising person. But yeah, so I think that's cool. All right. What do you think? Time to wrap this one up?
I think so, Mike.
All right. Well, listeners, thanks for joining us for yet another episode. We hope you found our conversation with Mike interesting and thought-provoking. And as always, if you have questions about what we've discussed, please feel free to get in touch with us. Our email is sailingtheeast, that's all one word, @gmail.com.
And finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, tell your friends about it. Hit that follow button or like button on your podcasting app. The more likes we get, the sort of more it bounces up in the search algorithms, and other people will find the podcast. So that's it for today's episode. I hope to see you out there on the water soon. Springtime is here. It's March while we're recording this, and the temperatures are above freezing now during the day. Snow's starting to melt. So I'm starting to think about putting away my skis, and I'm starting to order some of my maintenance parts for the boat to get it ready to put into the water. So until next time.
Delivery.
With
drone delivery.
Yes, drone delivery. So until next time, signing off from upstate New York. See you all soon.
And from over here in Münster, Germany, where it is feels like the first day of spring. It's touching, I think, about 60 Fahrenheit here, and blue sky and sun. So hopefully we'll send some of that warm weather your way. But listeners, thanks again, and we'll see everybody next time.